Okay, I'm gonna open this up and just first of all thank everybody for coming. This is a really momentous occasion because the Secretary of State is going to set the date of the 100th anniversary of New Hampshire's First in the Nation primary. And to help celebrate that, we have a number of dignitaries that are with us today that represent the actors that really put the primary together and help maintain its First in the Nation status. So with that, I'd like to introduce our Secretary of State, Bill Gardner, who will be setting the state, I believe, for the 11th time.
Okay. So, I'd like to first just introduce on this poster the person who sponsored the legislation in 1913 that actually created the presidential primary was Representative Stephen Bullock. And we have his great-granddaughter, Sybil, here with us. She was here during the filing period when Stephen Bullock came in to file. We had a little friendly discussion about that. The primary, it was a vision at the beginning, and it took a lot of dedication and perseverance. And so following what Representative Bullock did in 1913, before the first primary in 1916, a Representative John, but he was called George Glessner from Bethlehem, put in a bill to amend the original primary law. The original bill said that the primary would be in May. And so the legislature 2 years later, through Representative Glessner, amended it to say that it would be at the same time as our town elections, town meetings, the second Tuesday of March. So in 1916, the first primary, the poster for that is the one back here. It wasn't first in the nation, but it was first, and it was because of the great-grandfather of Sybil and Elizabeth Hamlin Carter.
You can add Glessner in there if you need to.
A lot of our churches have Hannibal Hamlin on the glass because he used to speak here a lot back in the 18.
Well, his statue's in the Hall of States down in the Capitol. So
it's been quite an interesting time the last week getting all of these together. I mean, it's really it's quite an honor actually for me to be here with those that have made this happen from the beginning. So this is Representative Glessner, and then at the top is Representative Upton. So after 1915, there wasn't any legislation until 1949. That's why we call the first era the quiet era, the quiet Bullock and Glessner era, that only the delegates were on the ballot, not the voters here could not vote directly for a presidential nominee. That happened because in the legislature in 1949, Richard Upton, who I had the privilege of knew for a number of years, he, as Speaker of the House, suggested that there be legislation to give the voters a direct vote. And so that passed in 1949, and 1952 became the first presidential primary that the voters here in New Hampshire would actually vote directly. And as that poster says at the top, every single person who has served as president of our country since 1952 has won at least one New Hampshire presidential primary. We have with us Richard Upton's son, Bill, who was, back when the political library was established, Bill was part of that, and the Upton family has had a long tradition in New Hampshire public life, with his grandfather and his father. So that's, and then under Richard Upton was Governor Hugh Gregg, and there's no person that I can even come close to what Governor Hugh Gregg did for this primary over the span of a half a century. He was governor at the beginning in 1952, and so next to my left is Cy Gregg, the oldest son of Hugh Gregg, and when I set the date back in the 80s and 90s, I had the Greggs and I had Jim Splain, and Hugh did it for several primaries, and then when he was no longer with us, his wife Kay and Cy have done it since 2004. And that was how we actually set it. So then, next up here is Jim Splain, the only one on the poster who is still alive. And in 1975, that was a critical time because it was, and the poster describes it as the challenging Splain era. The three eras was the transitional Upton era, and that was when we did both, and it was a transition from the beginning with just the delegates to just the candidates. So in 1975, the legislature, through the effort of Jim Splain, and with the strong help of the governor at the time, Governor Thompson, came up with a way to preserve the tradition instead of having to move the town meeting date up again and again. And so Jim Splain was a member of the House that year and did that. And
Still alive.
He's still alive. And next to Jim is Perry Smith, Natalie Smith Flanagan was the first woman chair of the election committee ever, and served as chair for 20 years. And she did a lot of tweaking of the law that would allow the primary, with Jim, that allow the primary to be on a day other than a Tuesday if necessary, would allow it to be more than 7 days ahead if that was necessary. And there were little changes like that that would provide flexibility to make sure that whatever happened, we would be able to overcome it. So during that time, there were states that actually, that the legislature passed laws saying that we're going to have the primary on the same day as New Hampshire. Whenever New Hampshire has it, by law, we're going to have it. And we had to deal with that back in the 90s, starting in the 90s. And because of the legislative action, started with Jim Splain and then through Natalie Smith, we were able to overcome those because of the flexibility that we had to do it. So Elizabeth, do you want to just...
It's hard to top all of that wonderful history. I maybe came the farthest today. I come from Bethlehem, New Hampshire, which was where this gentleman, John George Macbeth Glessner, came from. And I was reminded earlier that my grandmother, so his wife, was a committee woman for the state Republican Party, which I think back in the day was a kind of a very special thing for a husband and a wife to kind of be involved in politics. And he would travel down from Bethlehem and served 2 consecutive terms and then took a break and then served 2 more, and unfortunately then died an early death from a cold because they didn't have penicillin. So anyway, I'm happy to be here, and I appreciate you all taking the time to honor us, so thank you.
Thank you. And so Jim, since You are the one alive. It's you.
Bill likes to keep a mystery, and I know all of you are interested in just one thing today, and that is when the date's going to be. Is it going to be in December? Is it going to be the last Tuesday in January? Is it going to be February 4th? Is it going to be any other date that you might choose? And that's what the law gives Bill the opportunity to do, to keep the candidates and the campaigns and the media a little bit of mystery is sometimes a good thing. One of the benefits, but first you wanted a little history, so you're going to hear about 2 minutes of it from me. One of the benefits of living as long as I have is that you see a lot. And my first experience with the New Hampshire presidential primary was 1960, when I, in my north end of town in Portsmouth, where I live, distributed flyers as a 13-year-old for John F. Kennedy. And I have seen the evolution and had a role in every primary since then. And it has been a fascinating thing to watch. The benefit of the New Hampshire primary, and this is why I think we have fought to keep it first for so long, is that it gives candidates as well as voters an opportunity to get up close and personal with each other. You look eye to eye with the candidates, you look face to face. You can ask more questions when they're not at a podium with 2,000 people at some rally or 20,000 people at some rally someplace else. Right now, today, there is a 13-year-old boy or girl whose first experience with politics is going to be to meet one of the presidential candidates. That is a wonderful thing to do and an important element of democracy to preserve. We had a primary that came first, kind of by default, from 1920. And when it came to being debated by other states that wanted to jump ahead of us, and with the results of the 1968 and 1972 elections and Watergate, both political parties in New Hampshire as well as nationally wondered why have a first primary? Why not do it a different way? And there were a lot of people in New Hampshire, in both parties, who did not want to see the First in the Nation primary continue to come here because of the civil war that occurs within parties. People not talking with one another for years because of the intensity of 68 and 72 when we were at war in Vietnam, and you know what happened with Watergate. So I, as an active Democrat, as an active legislator at that time, I thought, let's make sure that we put it into law. So I came up with a piece of legislation in late 1974, talked with other people around, saying that New Hampshire would be first, mandating, not giving the Secretary of State or anyone else a chance to play with the primary, but mandating that it shall be 7 days or more ahead of any other similar election. Mel Thompson was governor at that time. Tom Thompson is with us today, his son. And as I talked with legislative leaders, I was thinking, let's have some kind of a committee do that. I didn't know the Secretary of State. That's before you. You were in the legislature, Bill, at that time. I didn't know the Secretary of State. But Mel Thompson said, let's not make it political, which was an important message for all of us. Because if you have a committee, if you have legislative leaders, if you have politicians deciding the First Nation primary date, guess what? You're going to have a politically decided date for the First Nation primary. So Mel suggested, let's look at somebody else. And as a discussion ensued, came up with one person having that authority, Secretary of State, whoever he or she is, sets the New Hampshire date instead of any political person, assuming that you're not political yourself. Bill has been able to bring artistry to that skill. He talks with the other secretaries of state and other states. He talks with legislative leaders. He's immune and insulated, I should say, from all of the political campaigns and the two political parties. He looks at the schedule. He waits until he really needs to set the date, and then he sets the date of the First in the Nation presidential primary. A time when candidates are going to have to come here in the next 10, 11, 12 weeks, depending on when he sets the date today in a few minutes, and talk with people instead of to or at people. They are going to have to talk with us. And I think that is the way that New Hampshire has contributed to save democracy in the United States. The primary is not about us. It's about our country and the future of democracy. Let's hope that we are able to maintain it and retain it for many years to come.
So we try to keep the tradition alive. That's why we have this desk. The Bullock family was given this desk. So in the last two presidential primaries, we've had the candidates sign up on these desks. And it's, we all stand on other people's shoulders a lot in life, and in this state, from all the way back to the beginning. I mean, we would not be here if it wasn't for Jim and for the just ancestors of those here that knew the ones that actually established this in the first place. And so that tradition, I don't know if the desk, we've used it, this is the second time. Before that, we used the desk that was the only piece of furniture in the State House when it opened in 1819. And so that, now we'll have it again. Well, I'd like to have Bill, if you'd have the first two. Would you like the candidates have signed up on the desk? Would you sign above your great grandfather?
We don't have to pay a filing fee for this, do we?
I didn't bring my checkbook.
I didn't either.
It's a certified check.
Okay. Next, Elizabeth, would you sign for your great grandfather?
You want printing here?
Yep. And Bill, would you do the honor for your father? Side, you do it for your father. Jim?
I'm not bad for an old man.
Terry, you do it. So as Jim mentioned, part of the job of Secretary of State is being patient, and patient so that you don't do something and then wish you had waited and did it later. And that's why the primary, I've done it the same way. The latest I've set the date was the 21st of December. This is sort of in between, from it can be late October in November as late as December 21st. And the primary itself, the filing period was pretty similar. We had 50 candidates. We had 58 4 years ago. Before that, it was in the 40s. The highest number of candidates we had was in the 1992 primary. We had 62 candidates. So in many ways, it's different, but it's also similar. So to acknowledge me, this will be my time to sign. So, in the pillars, and we call these families the pillars of the primary, these 6 that are here today. We have the dates of every primary, and in this pillar, we only had 2020. So I just filled in the date of the primary. And it was a fairly easy time this time compared to some of the other more tumultuous times. And the one before it was easy compared to some of those in the past. So do you have anything you
The only other thing that I would add, after Secretary Gardner introduced the dignitaries here, is that heard the Secretary say this many times, that the New Hampshire primary is for the little guy. It's the one place in the country where that person that had a childhood dream of growing up to be President of the United States has an opportunity to act on that desire. It's a low filing fee to get involved. You just have to meet the constitutional requirements to be President of the United States, 35 years of age, a natural-born United States citizen, and a 14-year resident of the country. And a $1,000 filing fee, and your name is on the ballot with everybody else that wants to hold that position. New Hampshire is a small state geographically and demographically. It's easy for a candidate to get around and meet people. And it is also very diverse in the ideologies that its citizenry have. And those ideas and beliefs are reflective of other parts of the country. And that's why New Hampshire has this status, why it's so important to the people that live here.
So, I mentioned the word vision at the beginning. Representative Bullock had the vision of letting as many people as possible be part of this process. And each step of the way, each of the changes that were made, Representative Glessner wanted to make it easier for people. That March was the month that they typically did their civic duty in those years. It was the time of the month here that was the best time to do that. So he added his vision to it and made that change. Then Richard Upton, in 1949, with new, more modern technology getting into people's houses, he made the change to let the voters vote directly for president. And the next legislative change after 1949 was Representative Jim Slane, that after having the primary for a half a century first, without having taken it from any other state, when other states began to think that maybe they should have it instead of New Hampshire, the vision was find a way that couldn't happen, that our tradition would be protected. And so he did his legislation, and Representative Flanagan did her ways of making sure that it would result in the tradition being protected. And Hugh Gregg in the middle here was the one that did almost everything during his 50 years. And it was all geared to the people of New Hampshire. It was about the people of New Hampshire. They were always willing to pay for this, and what has been the result? Since 1952, out of the 17 presidential primaries that we've had, 14 of the 17, the winner of the primary became president that year. And the other 3, the second place finisher, became president that year. And of those 3, they each won a subsequent presidential primary. That's why, and it's incredible to think about that. We have a big field. This ballot will have 33 candidates on the Democratic side. Republicans had 30 4 years ago. And it usually gets winnowed over time, and so it's a little easier, the percentages of being right. But this state, because of the exceptional turnout, the representation is huge compared to any other place in the country. So I think that's ready for questions unless any, yeah.
Bill, I think the only outstanding state that was subject to question was how you would treat the early voting in California. Could you just walk us through your view of that early voting, the fact that they're starting their voting, the week before the primary, I believe? It would be going on during the primary. And why is that not a similar election that would cause you to move the primary perhaps into January?
The early voting in California is limited, and I've actually researched that and talked to people who actually are involved in it, and it's not, it doesn't affect us.
Secretary Gardner, so have you seen a change in your time in the many years that you've been doing this, in terms of the influence of New Hampshire in the nominating calendar? Is it getting more nationalized? We've got a candidate saying he's not going to campaign in New Hampshire, not even on the ballot. A lot of other news breaking about things like that. But do you see any change in New Hampshire's influence over time, and particularly right now during the 2020 campaign cycle?
Not to any greater degree than people thought it would be nationalized when television was in its infancy and television was changing the nature of it, or when computers were first, the internet was first around back for the first time in the 2000 presidential primary. Some people thought that was going to be nationalizing it. That didn't happen, and it hasn't happened yet.
You just said that part of the New Hampshire primary's importance is turnout, and how it's very representative because of the high turnout for the primary. Are you concerned that the new voting law that is creating confusion by some critics, do you think that confusion in the new voting law will contribute to a decreased turnout and thus weaken the argument?
She asked if the House Bill 1264 impact turnout in any way.
The last presidential primary, New Hampshire was 52.4% of the voting eligible population. That's not the registered voters, that's the eligible, even those that aren't registered. In that primary, we were the only state in the country over 50% of the eligible voters. There was only one state that got over 40%. So the second state after New Hampshire was over 40. Every other state was either in the 30s or the 20s or the teens. And the average for the country was a little over 28%. In the presidential election of 16, New Hampshire was 14.5% higher than the country. You have to go back to 1960 to have New Hampshire be as high in a presidential election compared to the rest of the country. And in 2012, New Hampshire was 14.2%. So we went from 14.2 to 14.5. Both those presidential elections, we had photo ID. And in the presidential primary cycle, Wisconsin, for the first time, had photo ID in the 2016 Wisconsin primary. So the two states that had the highest for states that had photo ID. And at that time, people were saying the exact same things that they're saying today about the photo ID was going to cause 10% of the population not to be able to vote. It was going to affect all these people, unfortunately, and it was going to affect certain age groups more than others. And so I think that when you balance the ease of voting with the security of the process, that's the desire. And when you do that, states will be like us. We are the easiest state in the United States to vote. And we will remain the easiest state. 1264 does not change any part of the process of registering or voting. So I expect we're going to be just the way we were in the previous cycle. We've always been at the top of the country.
Mr. Secretary, can you let us know exactly when you made up your mind?
Exactly.
Like, can you tell us when, for sure, you knew it was going to be the 11th?
When you,
When did you pick the date? When in your mind
When in
did you
your
know
mind?
the date?
Oh. Well, it's a lot easier if it was going to be February 11th. It'd be a lot easier. And some cycles, the national parties have been helpful. In some cycles, they haven't. And the last two cycles, the national parties have been helpful for us. So I was always looking at that date because I knew that it would not be later in the year. Our law still says that the primary shall be on the second Tuesday of March.
The red one.
If
Yes.
we could
so
do it on that day
if
and
it's
keep the
something
tradition,
that is,
Secretary of State wouldn't
members
be
are
involved
appointed
in
by
this
Gardner
at all.
Council, it would be
So,
listed in the red book.
I knew that it wouldn't
and
be any
the
later
terms
than
are usually
February
listed
11th.
beside the members.
And I was hoping that
So
it wouldn't have to be any earlier.
it is,
But
so it would be,
the
website is
I don't know
sos.nh.
all that's happening across the country
.gov.
immediately. Sometimes it takes
All right,
some
so
weeks
if
or
you're on
months
that
to
page, I think
know
it's
that
on
the state has made a
administration,
certain change.
and there's a
and
menu that drops
so
down. If you go to
I would set
Governor
the date
Council,
as early as
that
I
next
could. I
page,
don't
there's a
need
link for the
to
red book.
wait, but I want to make sure that when I do set it, it won't have to be changed.
To the left.
And I have
there's,
never had to set a date and then
like in
have to change it.
parentheses, red book is in blue, which is
And that's
ironic
really
that it's blue.
important to me in this process, that
Not
it's,
red.
to jump the gun. And
It would be
I've
in
had
there
for all
if-
these years, this
if
guy
it's
next to
appointments
me,
by Governor Council.
yeah,
If
the
it's
one's
not,
still
right
alive,
next signature would be to go
prodding me
to
to
the
say, you know,
of tax
be
lien
patient.
appeals.
you be
And they may
patient,
have a list
be
there.
patient. And so, this is
It's not,
is a time that,
those the
it's,
terms,
you know,
okay.
Guy Gregg has been with me since, doing it since 2004, and his father before. This is the time.
What other states were you watching? Were there ever any other states
Right,
that
so,
raised a bit of a
yep,
concern
so
and then
to
were
the
no
right,
longer of
you're
concern?
looking at the
Were there other
spreadsheet?
states that were considering
No,
moving into our window, if you will?
Yep.
Well-
But then decided against it?
The only other state that
you should
has
be
the
able
Secretary of State
to.
set the date is Georgia. And the last time I was actually with the Secretary of State of Georgia, I talked to him about it, and he had
I'm in a
not,
page where it says
decided,
at
and I
the
asked him
top,
if it was
state
gonna be
government executive
the
department.
same date that the previous Secretary of State, Brian Kemp, had sent. And he said, no, I don't think so. So I had to wait naturally for him to make his decision, and he made the decision
Let me
a few
just see
months
if I can
back.
find.
Any of you guys want to?
Yeah.
Mr.
Yeah,
Secretary,
so
can I
if-
just
if
ask,
you're looking to the
Maine
left
and
of that,
Massachusetts, neighboring states,
do you see where it
do
says
early
red
voting.
book in blue?
What is the argument for having
you
no
click on
early
that.
voting in New Hampshire?
I want New Hampshire
Oh,
to,
it's not opening up another
Remain
roll.
at the
It
top
should literally
for voting,
open up 172 pages
and
book for you.
facts speak for themselves.
No, okay. So
And
let me see if
early
I can
voting
find-
does not guarantee that you get more people to vote. And in a state like New Hampshire with the political culture that we have here and the political tradition that we have here, voting is a community.
So I'm wondering if
It's
it's
not
not like
a-
it's from the governor and
It's a
council.
community thing, and it's done at the local level and at the state level. And so there was a report issued in the American Journal of Political Science in 2014. And in that report, they had a number of political scientists
When
study
Keely's
all
back,
the
I'll
states
see
that
if
had
she
gone to
knows.
early voting. And the conclusion of that study was that you could expect between a 3.6% and 4% decline in turnout. Now, that's counterintuitive. That's like, that doesn't make any sense. How can you make something easier and then
All right, if I
have
can
it
find it, I'll call you right back. and I'll
result
wait
in
for Keely
fewer
to get
people
back.
voting? And it's, to me, it's
Sure.
a simple thing. It's part of human nature. It's part of us as humans. That when you see people in line early, when people go
Okay,
Thanksgiving night to beat the crowd, and there's all kinds of lines,
I'll see what I can
it
find
makes
out.
people think that
You're
it's
welcome.
going to be lines, even worse lines later. So when you see on television, or you hear, or you read that these states have 3-hour waits 2 weeks before on a Saturday for voting, the psyche is that if you don't do that, you end up, it's gonna be impossible to be able to do it on election day. And so, think about this, in our last 3 presidential primaries, 2 of them, we had less than 5% absentee voting. And, I mean, yeah, and one of them, we had 7%. Now that's, I mean, that's unheard of in the country. And one of those primaries was in early January, when there are a lot of people. So we are going to have the absentee ballots available for people in this state at Christmas time. For those that are, but I don't expect it to be any different. And that tradition
I'll take this one, my envelopes and then my desk.
here, if we had early voting, take 4 years ago, take Ohio. Ohio had a presidential primary on March 15th. They started their early voting on February 15th, 30 days before. Before their primary on March 15th, Jeb Bush dropped out, Ben Carson dropped out, some other candidates dropped out. And I happened to be sitting next to the Ohio Secretary of State a year and a half ago at one of our meetings. And I mentioned that to him, and I said, how many people actually voted in your primary for those candidates that had dropped out? I said, could you get it to me when I get back home? And he said, I can get it to you right now. So he was on his phone, and he shows it to me. So, and it's in tens and tens and tens of thousands of votes cast that end up, there's no candidate at the time of the election. And it happened with Marco Rubio. So for us, New Hampshire, we're unique because we don't have provisional ballots. 46 states in the country have provisional ballots. We don't have provisional ballots. Everyone votes a ballot like everyone else. And so we're the easiest state in the country to vote, because when you go into that polling place to register, you can still register even if you don't have identification. You sign an affidavit, but when you then go to get your ballot, you have your picture taken. No other state in the country has a person have their picture taken. And in the last presidential election, 755,600 people in this state voted in that presidential election. 1,044 had their picture taken and not one left. So it's the security balanced with the ease to make it as easy as we can, and we do, but we make it so that people have confidence in the security and integrity of it. And, you know, we get pulled by both sides. One side saying we don't need the security. Another side saying we don't need it to be the easiest in the country. But it's that balancing act. And the proof is in the statistics. And the statistics are there. It's a long one, but it gets back to early voting. Campaigns here, think of it. Well, you have to read about it, but you didn't live it. But I've lived it, and other people in this room have lived it. Campaigns build to a crescendo. And if you have 15 days of election, because you have early voting, the real election day is just an insignificant event. But in this state, because of the nature of this state and how many elections we've had, that candidates do things that last week or that last weekend that showed the people of New Hampshire what they're made of, their character, that crystallized in their minds why they thought they were going to vote for this person, and why they wait, why we are notoriously late deciding voters. In the primary, the people of this state understand the privilege that we have. They want to do the right thing. They want to find out as much as they possibly can about the candidates to make their choice. And they wait, and they wait. And as I said, roughly 95% of the votes will be cast on primary day. They want to see what happens that weekend before. And there's been several instances where it has made a huge difference. But that's the nature of New Hampshire. That's our political culture. It's we're not just passing out things, let people vote 3 weeks, 2 weeks before. And look at our record. It speaks for itself. And look at whether you go to presidential primary or the presidential election, where we are, where we stand. Third, second. We haven't, we've been ahead of Vermont. Last cycle we were ahead of Maine, in the other states, but none of those states are like us because they have provisional ballots. They're part of the 46 states.
Are you worried about the security of the first in the nation status given the conversations of diversity? And would you ever consider New Hampshire sharing the first status with a more diverse state?
Sharing it?
With a more diverse state to combat the criticisms of diversity?
Well, actually, when Representative Blaine was in the House, there was an attempt to have the other New England states share it. Instead of a first in the nation New Hampshire presidential primary, that there be a first in the nation New England presidential primary. And it was that effort that led to
Well, I'll only observe that, there's a good question here. What state is the perfect state for the first in the nation primary? Diversity is certainly important. We have a lot of economic diversity in New Hampshire. We also have the influences of a population that has a certain amount of diversity. But most importantly is that opportunity to be able to get candidates out of their comfort zone and be able to have that dialogue while the rest of the nation is watching and seeing how they handle some of the questions that at times are not all that easy. And we've seen examples of that through the years where candidates actually stumble or candidates do very well, such as Ronald Reagan saying, "I paid for this microphone, Mr. Green," even though it was John Green, the union leader of the Fawcett Valley Democrat at the time. And he got great attention in 1980, and probably the New Hampshire primary contributed to his election. We've seen that kind of attitude in our elections. And what would be better than a smaller state, which New Hampshire is, where people, geography is to the advantage of candidates who want to get to all parts of New Hampshire and be able to talk with people instead of from a podium, behind a camera, at or to us. And I think New Hampshire is as good as any for that. I do think that we have some balance in what both political parties have done with their system, their schedule after New Hampshire.
Secretary Gardner, if the question was about racial diversity, what is the response? What's your response to that? You know, people saying New Hampshire is not racially diverse enough, doesn't represent the country.
Well, I would first say that's true. And then I would say, when then Senator Obama was first campaigning in New Hampshire, a person got up in the crowd and said, "What do you think of this, having to campaign in a place that no one looks like you?" And his answer was, "Well, these people are all Red Sox fans for the most part, except a few. And I'm a White Sox fan, but does that make any difference?" And when he filed, I had a few minutes with him in my office, just the two of us. And I mentioned to him that and how not many people would get away with an answer like that, but that he did. And I explained to him about one of the portraits in Representatives Hall, John Parker Hale, the first U.S. Senator to call for the abolition of slavery on the Senate floor. His statue out in front of the State House. Frederick Douglass came to New Hampshire when that statue was unveiled in 1892 and said that he shouldn't have been there, he wasn't well, but he had to come because he said that man has done more for me and my people than anyone except Abraham Lincoln. And then he went on to explain why. And what I told President Obama was that in the years where the diversity had been an issue, more so than this time, although it always tends to come up, New Hampshire has been in the forefront of some of the most significant social advances made in this country. And when you ask people, or experts, what is the state that reflects the country demographically, they'll often say Illinois. So I told President Obama, not Senator then, he had never heard this. New Hampshire was the state that let Jackie Robinson become the first black Major League Baseball player. Obama was, I've never heard that. Tell me about that. And I said, it's interesting because your state is involved in this, Illinois. I said, well, how's that? I said, well, Branch Rickey, the manager of the Brooklyn Dodgers, wanted to integrate baseball desperately. But he didn't want to do it too early. And he wanted Jackie Robinson to be the one. And he had Jackie Robinson playing up in Montreal. In the spring of 1946, he had this ball player in New Jersey that he asked the scout. And I heard the scout tell the story. I want you to go watch this guy. Great infielder, but I want you to watch his hitting. When he came back, he said to Branch Rickey, look, I couldn't take my eyes off the pitcher. That pitcher can play Major League Baseball. Now, why was Ricky doing this? Because he had a team in Danville, Illinois, that said, we'll be the first in the country to take a black player. The first in any minor league organization. And so, when he told about the pitcher, Ricky said, okay, bring him to me. Bring him to me next Saturday. And so the scout takes him. Ricky's got a board meeting during that Saturday, came out twice, didn't have a lot of time, and the scout said his mother was there with him, and the guy was Don Newcomb. He said, look, his mother's got a job in Newark, she's got to be there at 5 o'clock. He said, well, give him a contract. Well, what kind of a contract? Give him a whiteboard contract. So they sign him up to go to play in Danville, Illinois. The week before he's to leave to go to Danville, Illinois, Ricky gets a message that every other minor league team in that league out there had decided to boycott. So they had no one to play if they took him. So they had to say, you can't send him. Well, Ricky had just established a new Brooklyn Dodgers affiliate in Nashua, New Hampshire. And he called the manager and he asked the manager if he'd be willing to take a black player. And the guy said yes. And then he said, you know, I think I'd like to send the second one. Would you mind taking 2? He said, okay. So Don Newcomb and Roy Campanella get sent to Nashua to play in the summer of '46. And Don Newcomb, I heard Don Newcomb tell this story, how every week Branch Rickey would call them, how are you guys doing? How are you guys doing? And he said, we're doing fine, we're doing fine. After a month, he said, come on, there's got to be something that you're not happy about. And he said, well, I can't find a barber here that can deal with my head of hair, and I just can't. At the end of the summer, Ricky called him and said, you know why I was bugging you guys? Because I really want Jackie Robinson to play. And I don't want to do it too early, because if I do, it could set it back 5 or 10 years. But if you can make it in New Hampshire, he can make it in Brooklyn. And that spring of '47, when he took him, and that's the story. That's how the first black player. So in a state where certain things are not expected, when they happen, they have a huge impact. And we have had some huge impact over the years, because human beings are human beings. And if you get away from this other stuff, New Hampshire is a state that probably no one would think would be the state to do this. And very few people even know this story. But that's the way it is. And that's what I say about diversity, and that's why I said to Senator Obama how much I appreciated reading what he had said on point on your very questions.
Or on the opposite side, Republican.
Secretary Gardner, you and some of the other people here today have referred a number of times to New Hampshire's high level of turnout. How important is maintaining that level of turnout to maintaining New Hampshire's first in the nation status? In other words, if turnout were to start to dip, do you think it would be harder to make the argument that New Hampshire should stay first?
Do you see what
Well,
do you understand what I'm saying?
If it were to,
Yeah.
we would certainly look at it.
It doesn't add to his own
If you go back to
It's counted separately
1952,
in the opposite
every
primary.
single presidential election since
And vice
1952,
versa, say.
only one time did New Hampshire be below the country as a whole, and that was in 1984. And we were astounded, because all day long, you and the press, not you personally, but were reporting massive turnout in New Hampshire. No one has ever seen anything like this. All the election officials were astounded. Lines all day long.
Yeah.
But what we found was that because
what
there
she
were
said is correct,
13
it just doesn't
constitutional
tell the
amendment
whole
questions
story.
on the ballot, that people were in that booth
You're very welcome.
a long time. And in the cities that had lever machines, they only had 10 booths, Portsmouth, Manchester, Nashua, Exeter. So people were lined up because the people were trying to read these, and it was a page and a half of these questions. So we learned from that it wasn't the biggest turnout, it was actually the worst. But you learn from it. So we will learn from things if something were to make it any different. We are the easiest state in the country. I challenge anyone to contradict that. Based on no provisional ballots, based on election day registration at the polls, based on no durational residency requirement. Minnesota has been up at the top, but Minnesota has a 20-day residence requirement. So there's not another state that has those things. Yet all we hear is about these poll taxes and voter suppression. It is just dishonest. And the facts show that. You take any other state in the country and do a fact-to-fact comparison.
Just a follow-up to that, the turnout is obviously near the top of the list during presidential cycles. It falls a little bit when you look at, for example, midterms, state elections, even local elections like the ones that we have this fall. How do you reconcile the level of participation that we see in the primary with the level of civic engagement overall in those other contexts?
Very easily. In the last midterm election, we did not have a U.S. Senate race. 2/3 of the states had a U.S. Senate race. If you want to make fair comparisons, compare when all states have the same office at the top of the ballot. Because otherwise, Senate races nowadays can be 20 million, can be 40 million, can make a big difference. So midterm elections are not as fair to use because states have different offices on the ballot.
Jim, can I ask a quick question? You've been traveling in Democratic circles for a very long time. On the diversity question, have you ever, I know that the DNC and both parties have agreed to move South Carolina and Nevada up a bunch of years ago to kind of create, a quad of states. But have any of your friends brought up the issue of diversity when they talk about their responsibility voting in New Hampshire, A? And B, have you, as the person who's kind of put it into law that we're always going to be 7 days ahead of everybody, have you thought about what negative impact it might have if, say, New Hampshire were third, Iowa, Nevada, New Hampshire, or say some combination of moving them around in any way, like to see mentally whether or not, ignoring the 7-day law for a second and just saying, our impact would still, what would our impact really be if Nevada went second, say was the first primary in the second contest, and New Hampshire was the third? Have you thought about that at all? Have people talk to you about that?
And you're asking a number of questions all combined together.
Sorry.
When I first talked about this in 1975, the issue came up. And I sponsored or co-sponsored several laws since with Natalie Flanagan and others to update the New Hampshire primary, now allowing the Secretary of State to actually move ahead of Iowa if necessary, if he determines that that's a similar election in any way, such as early voting, absentee voting, whatever they may do, or going into December, the previous year. Two things I think come into play when we're talking about voting. Human beings are human beings. There will always be an analysis after an election as to who voted and why. So I don't think that the lack of population diversity in New Hampshire negates the impact of the New Hampshire voting system in the primary. Secondly, Iowa is not an election. Iowa is a caucus. We don't have too many caucuses now in this country because Iowa is not an election. New Hampshire is the first place where people actually go in and vote their own conscience. They can vote for whomever they wish. They can vote in privacy, as opposed to Iowa or any other caucus where you come together and, people are dividing and speaking up and lobbying for their own candidate, being bused to the events, given lunch, so that they can spend 2-3 hours at a caucus or whatever it is. The New Hampshire primary is important because of that, and you cannot underestimate this. The opportunity of candidates to have to meet with people in ways they do not have to do in a lot of other states. And I think that that is the primary reason why we should protect it. No party, no other state gives New Hampshire the first-in-the-nation primary. Many have tried to take it away from us by having rules or reducing delegate influence by New Hampshire at conventions, but neither the National Republican and National Democratic Party have been successful at doing so, because we do have a law that says, and we pay for it, we're going to be first. They could hold caucuses if they wanted to in New Hampshire, but they decided not to. Our primary is first, no matter what, and I think that's an important thing. The economic diversity is something that should not be underrated, and we do have people in New Hampshire doing all sorts of work, all sorts of work, like we have the tourist industry, we have the fishing industry, we have the lakes, we have the kinds of manufacturing that still a lot of other states don't have, and we certainly have a lot of high technology. And I think that diversity is what influences the decisions of voters on election day.
Can you just take a second to explain? Are you hearing this with your friends, say, when you go to some of the events, or are a lot of Democrats talking about the issue of diversity?
Not a great deal. I think more people are concerned about the way that the candidates campaign. I know that there was one candidate on the Democratic side who decided, and he took a couple of swings at New Hampshire, not to continue his race in New Hampshire. I think he was just having a hard time making his case. Whereas other candidates who indeed do talk about a lot of issues of diversity and acceptance are still in the race, and they're going to continue talking about those kinds of issues right up until February 11th.
Great, thank you very much.
Thank you.
I just wanted to ask, I'm Jack from the podcast. Are you going to be able to give us a just a moment to talk about